Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Dominique Charron.
My name is Dominique Charron. I am the VP of Programs and Partnership at Idrc.
I'm the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at Canada's International Development Research Centre. Welcome. Bienvenue. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, and we thank them for sharing their land with us. J'aimerais aussi vous rappeler qu'il y a des écouteurs.
I'd like to remind you that there are headsets.
Those of you who might require simultaneous translation, although the presentations will be in English. Celebrating International Women's Day is a long-standing tradition at IDRC and a great personal honor for me to be here today to kick us off this year. We know that equality between women and men and gender equality more generally is an end in itself and an important one. And we also know that it's a necessary condition for achieving healthy, prosperous, sustainable communities. Restrictive social norms, dire economic conditions, and weak governance systems. These are all structural factors that get in the way of gender equality. Violence against women, and the topic of our conversation today, is one of the most visceral and unaddressed, frankly, manifestations of this global challenge. Notre panel aujourd'hui.
Our panel today is composed of researchers and activists working in countries of the South. They want to find solutions in digital training for women, collective action for positive change, for gender equality.
Role that research plays to expose the root causes of violence, to elevate women's voices as they share their experiences and coping mechanisms and ideas for solutions, and to test initiatives that engage everyone, men, women, communities, to address and deal with and get rid of violence. IDRC is committed to this kind of research that gets at the complex issues at the root of gender inequality and violence. And this is a kind of work that requires work across stakeholders. It can take quite a bit of time, and IDRC contributes to bringing people together to find solutions in this, in these complex problems. In addition, and for this kind of reason, IDRC is proud to be a co-sponsor with the Government of Canada and many other sponsors in the Women Deliver Conference being held in Vancouver in June in 86 days. Il s'agit de la plus grande.
This is the biggest conference in the world on gender equality, and it is a precious opportunity, special opportunity to work together and to develop an action plan that is based on evidence and research evidence.
In our Solutions to Gender Equality speaker series, which is leading up to Women Deliver in June. We look forward to unveiling a full program of activities for that conference in the weeks to come. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce IDRC's chairperson, Margaret Biggs, who will serve as the moderator for the panel. J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter la présidente du
I'm pleased to introduce the chair of the Board of Governors of IDRC, Margaret Biggs, who will be chairing the panel.
Development Agency, CEDA, from 2008 to 2013, where she oversaw Canada's international development and humanitarian assistance efforts worldwide. Previously, Margaret served as Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet and Assistant Secretary for Priorities and Planning in the Privy Council Office, among many other things. She is champion of gender equality and of the Centre's work in this area, and it's a great honor to have her join us today in this role. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dominique, and good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi à tous. Thank you again for joining us here at IDRC to celebrate International Women's Day and to take part in this important discussion. So it's really my pleasure here to serve as a moderator and in a moment to introduce our panelists who are here to share their expertise on today's theme, which, as you know, is at work, in transit, and online, solutions to address gender-based violence. Je suis ravie d'agir à titre de modératrice et de vous présenter dans un moment nos panélistes.
I will be introducing in a moment our panelists who are here to express their expertise on the theme at work, in transit, and online, solutions to address gender-based violence.
So gender-based violence, in many its forms, as Dominica said, is a manifestation of deeply entrenched gender inequalities. It's an unaddressed challenge in our own country, in other developed countries, and in developing countries with far-reaching implications, not just for women, but for societies as a whole. So our panelists are going to describe varied experiences of violence that women and marginalized groups face in the workplace, in public transportation as they go back and forth between work and their homes and their shopping, and that they face in the workplace and in digital spaces. So lessons shared with us today reflect projects that are supported by IDRC in Brazil, India, and Pakistan. Our panel members are going to share with us some of the ways that gendered structural barriers contribute to the vulnerability of women to violence. And then most importantly, they're going to share with us some of the tools, approaches, and policies that can help us dismantle these barriers and to ultimately help eliminate gender-based violence. So let me introduce our esteemed panel. I'm going to start on my right with Joana Verão. She's the founder, director, and policy strategist at Coding Rights, a Brazil-based women-run organization working to expose and redress the power imbalances built into technology and its applications. She's a Brazilian lawyer and researcher with project management experience at the Ford Foundation, the World Bank. So welcome, Joana. Thank you for being here. And then on my right here, I have Rakhi Sehgal. She's a labor researcher and activist in India. She's supporting efforts to organize women workers as part of the Working Women's Union in the state of Haryana. She's been a consultant with the ILO and is currently leading a 4-country project supported by IDRC that focuses on making workplaces safe for women working in the garment industry. Welcome. In the middle, Amar Malik is the Associate Director of Research at Evidence for Policy Design at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He oversees labor market and education research portfolios in the Middle East. And prior to this role, he was a research associate at the Urban Institute, where he led research on women's economic empowerment and urban resilience building. I think in that capacity, you were associated with the GROW program here at IDRC. So welcome, Amar. So we have 3 fabulous speakers, researchers here with us today, and we're going to take the conversation in 3 blocks. We're going to set the stage with each of our experts painting a picture around the experiences of gender-based violence from their respective perspectives and contexts that they've been studying. And then we're going to go into what they call a lightning round, a rapid-fire round that they're all primed for. They're going to basically spit out really quickly, touch briefly on the structural drivers that they think are driving these forms of violence. And then we're going to end in the 3rd section that's going to focus on solutions, on some of the emerging results from their research, promising interventions, and ways forward to approach gender-based violence. And that'll give them a chance to talk specifically to their research. And then we're going to turn the microphone over to you, have a chance for audience participation, questions and answers for our panelists. So keep in mind any questions that you might have, jot them down and keep them in mind for a little bit later. So that's it. So we're going to go to our discussion. Each of our panelists works in different contexts, different country situations, different regions. And so we're going to take a moment to start off by understanding a little bit more about the context of your own work. So I'm going to start with Rakhi. So your work analyzes workplace violence against women in the garment sector in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, and Indonesia. So tell us a little bit about how prevalent this is, gender-based violence in the garment sector, and what have been some of your experiences with the women in those sectors, and how have you approached your research?
Sure. Well, gender-based violence is very prevalent and is one of the leading causes for huge turnover in the labor force, particularly amongst the women. A 2016 report by Sisters for Change found that 1 in 14 garment workers has experienced physical violence, 1 in 7 has been raped or forced to perform a sexual act, and only 3.6% of reported cases of violence resulted in any action being taken by the factory or by the police, and zero criminal charges were ever brought against the perpetrators. There's another survey in 2015 by the Federation of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Ernst & Young that focused on the companies and found that 35% of Indian companies and 25% of multinational corporations did not comply with the Indian Act, the law, Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act of 2013. And this survey also found that 44% of these companies surveyed did not conspicuously display the disciplinary and penal consequences of sexual harassment at the workplace, which is something that they are supposed to do under the law. And while women have shared with us that they have to take permission from the male members of their families to even go out to work, and then they face harassment on the way to work, which Amar will talk about. Once they reach the factories, the kind of violence that they face on the shop floor ranges from verbal abuse, sexually laced comments and innuendos, uncomfortable jokes, propositions, touching, pinching, pulling of bra straps, any excuse to stroke their hair, their shoulders, their backs, to molestation and rape, coercion, threats, routine deprivations of liberties, extremely high intensity of work and forced overtime, coupled with humiliation, isolation, bullying, and hazing. Some women even shared with us that when they ask for breaks to go to the toilet or breaks from work to deal with menstrual cramps, their male supervisors or managers will sometimes ask inappropriate and invasive questions about their sex lives, which makes them really, really uncomfortable. In terms of drivers of violence, it really starts with lacking formal contracts, employment contracts, precarious employment, which means hire and fire, and only providing them with daily waged work rather than longer term work. And very importantly, transmission of patriarchal cultural and social norms through recruitment channels that then coalesce in supervisory structures on the shop floor and gendered labor disciplining mechanisms, which is really, really problematic. And remember, many of these women are of rural origin, barely educated, and they're extremely vulnerable. They're underpaid and overworked, actively prevented from unionizing, and yet when they try to take a complaint, it's mostly treated as a false complaint, and they are treated as liars, and they're told that they are turning a production issue into a sexual harassment issue and that it's a false complaint. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of violence that women workers face on the shop floor, and hopefully we'll be able to talk a bit more about it.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to just turn to Amar. So Amar, your work, and you've looked at social media movements that have brought heightened visibility to women's mobility challenges, and your research is focused on violence and the perceived risk of violence experienced by Pakistani women in public transportation and how it impacts their lives. So can you tell us a little bit more about your research, what forms of violence women are experiencing in their, they work and when they're on public transportation to and from work?
Sure. Women face harassment throughout the world, unfortunately, in public transport systems in cities around the world. A lot of global surveys show that over 80% women report having faced either sexual or verbal harassment while in transit in their lifetime. And the city that we focused in, the Lahore, which is 11 million population, second largest city in Pakistan, situation unfortunately is no different. And let me tell you how I actually arrived at this topic. My dissertation and my research was basically focused on the economic impact of public transportation or mass transport upgrades. And as I looked at data, survey after survey, I realized that men and women in Lahore were having completely different transport experiences, even for the same origins and destinations. Let me give you a few examples that stood out. Women are 4 times more likely to travel with children. So if an elevator is not working or an escalator is stopped, it's a much bigger problem. They are almost twice as likely to walk to work rather than take other public transport systems, which means you're more vulnerable on walking on the street. If it's hot, it's raining, it's a problem. They are also almost twice, they're paying almost twice more for the same origin and destination because they're circumventing areas which they might perceive as being unsafe. And this is despite the fact that they have 30% less income overall from our sample. So what I realized by looking at this is that harassment is obviously rampant and that there was not really a conversation in the public sphere about this. So what we ended up doing initially with IDRC support and later other colleagues and donors helped out was actually design a custom smartphone app, sort of like Safety Pin, which gets a lot of attention in India, but it's a custom app that we built. And then we basically gave it to about 20 or 25 young men and women, mostly women, but a few men, and had them basically go around the city, go about their daily business, riding different public transport modes. And throughout their journeys, we would send them little messages or pings to say, can you please do a survey? So what they did in those surveys was basically record their perception of safety in a public space. So they would observe things like, I'm in a dark alley, somebody might be following me, or there's this like vendor standing on the side, the bus stop's condition is really bad, whatever conditions they are. And then with hundreds and hundreds of those surveys, we've now started to map those out in the city so that we can create heat maps on which areas are bad and good and what factors contribute to that. And the idea was to actually work with policymakers, supply this data to them, and hope that law enforcement could improve patrolling and make it smarter. And another thing that we found, interestingly perhaps, is that the last mile, which is when you step out of your doorstep to get to the mass transit system, in the case of Lahore is a BRT line, bus rapid transit line, that's the biggest problem. And the other big problem is queuing to get onto the buses. Once you get on the bus because of CCTV cameras and this and that, you're much safer. So I think, if anything, we're learning that there are very nuanced ways in which women face harassment in different places, and it's not necessarily a big cost to solve those problems, as I'll describe later on.
Thanks very much, Amar. So I'm going to turn now to Joanna. So Joanna, your organization, Coding Rights, uses technology to increase the visibility of human rights. What can you tell us about how gender-based violence has permeated the digital spaces? And can you share some examples from your work?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So it's becoming astonishingly frequent that women who speak up in social media get targeted with hate, censorship, and other forms of technology-enabled violence fostered by sexism or other expressions of patriarchal values. In Coding Rights, as we are part of a feminist digital security network, we promote awareness raising and information about digital security, but sometimes cases also come to us for help. Sometimes those cases are about women being harassed by ex-partners, but a lot of the time it's about women or queer people whose work have a higher public visibility, such as journalists, politicians, artists, activists, even gamers. And more they have to learn how to operate between the freedoms and the power the internet could give to their voices and the threats that it also brings. One paradigmatic example that happened was a group of women articulating against by that time a candidate for presidency, today the president. They were articulating in a group called Women United Against Bolsonaro due to his very sexist speeches and even violent speeches against LGBT rights and against gender equality. And one of the actions of the group was to organize a protest within the first and second round of the elections. After growing very quickly with the numbers of members in their Facebook page, their page was hacked, invaded, so the admins, the women who were admins were kicked out of the group. People who hacked it started to add followers of Bolsonaro and postings pro-Bolsonaro, and the personal information of the admins were also leaked on the internet for the haters to keep hating. And a few days before the protest, one of the admins got attacked by a few men in front of her house, and so on. So, nevertheless, because women rocks, the protests were huge and all over the city, but the president won. So, but the point that I want to make here is that there is a continuum between the online and offline interactions. This division, online and offline, is actually fake because it's impossible to separate the consequences of the actions that occur in digital environments and the offline environments. And this notion of the continuum is very important to understand that all those historical structural challenges for dealing with gender-based violence are transposed to the online, to the digital environments as well. So challenges of access to justice, lack of sensitization of law enforcement agencies, and so on and so forth.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Thanks. So we have a sense of the context and the work that our three panelists are doing. So we're going to move to the fast round, the lightning round now, and ask each of you to talk about, in your view, from your research, what are the drivers here? What are the root causes, the structural drivers that are leading to this gender-based violence? And this is work that Idrc has been supporting. So, Amar, take a minute, just a minute, to help us zero in on the root causes as you see them in terms of women's lack of mobility and experiences of violence in Pakistan.
The way we see this is a person's mobility, whether it's a man or a woman, depends on a bunch of factors. And I put them in 3 levels in my conceptual framework. One is like just personal circumstances. You know, how much income do you have? Do you own a car? Are you healthy? Can you walk properly? Things like that. Then there's those neighborhood or geographically specific things, like, are you living in a safe neighborhood? Is there 2 feet of water standing outside your home? Will you be harassed? Or you're living in an unsafe or bad area? And then there are some society level factors, like, is there a reason for you to go out? You need a job for that, right? So is there enough demand for jobs? Are social norms preventing you from accessing jobs or mobility? So what I see is, if you think about it, in all of these levels, women have very peculiar conditions, and women are affected differently. And what I found in my work, not just in Pakistan but in other places, is that public policies don't always address those peculiar concerns. Public transport is often planned by men, mostly for men, and things like elevators not working, escalators not working are a big problem. So I think that's how I would think about this, is like, think about a person as an individual and then see how men, women, and for that matter, other groups are affected differently.
Thanks, Amar. So, Raki, the same question for you.
Sure.
So, can you elaborate on the structural and the intersectional drivers of violence in your work?
Sure. It starts right away with structural inequalities, crushing poverty, social oppressions of caste, religion, region, distress migration, lack of ownership of assets or land, and the fact that 99.9% of the managerial staff is male, as is the Labor Department, the Police Department, and any other institution that the woman seeks to access for justice. Then there is a lack of rule of law, particularly rampant in the third world countries, and lack of implementation of labor laws and sexual harassment laws, and increasingly active union busting and active undermining, if not outright obstruction of freedom of association and collective bargaining, influenced, of course, by the fact that many of these sectors are part of global supply chains that thrive on and profit from labor arbitrage. And the fact that national governments are increasingly selling their economies as locales of low wages, lax labor laws, ease of doing business, and national governments are more concerned with promoting and protecting investor rights rather than labor rights, and trying to help the workers to equalize the imbalance of power. So these are really some of the quick pointers to violence.
Thank you. Thank you. So Joanna, just over to you. So you've told us a little bit about how the offline or the online violence are many of the same factors. So tell us a little bit more about what you think is the same or the differences in how women experience violence online.
Mm-hmm. I think we also need to take into account that technology-enabled violence against women or gender-based violence is also an intersectional debate. So if you consider class, race, non-binary gender people, or non-hetero expression of sexuality, those people are also the ones that are most targeted online. Myself, as a queer person in the rise of the extreme right in Brazil, also do feel my existence more threatened in this continuum of the online-offline because of having this identity, but on the other hand, also having lots of privileges of other people. I feel more protected than many others of my colleagues. So we need to have in mind the intersectionality as something that we need to deconstruct in a lot of layers, as a hard individual and collective task, but can be done in many forms. In Brazil right now, it was Carnival. I flew over and left Carnival to come here.
Come here, yeah.
Thank you. But I had the opportunity to live a very historical moment, which was the Parade of Mangueira. It's a samba school, and their task in the avenue was to rewrite history very briefly, giving space for other heroes that are not in the history books, giving space for black, poor, indigenous people and heroes in the avenue. And okay, traveling from our colonization to nowadays, they also made a homage to Marielle Franco, our councilwoman, who was a black lesbian fighting against police brutality and killings of the youth in the favelas, and she was killed because she spoke up on all those issues. And since today, next week, it's going to be 1 year that of her assassination. Nothing happened. Nobody was found guilty. And Women Against Bolsonaro are organizing a huge protest for that. But what I want to stress here is that Mangueira managed to present a masterclass of intersectionality to the whole world, or at least to the whole Brazil, in a very creative way, in a very powerful way, and we need to do and have more experiences like that.
Well, thank you, and thanks for coming to Canada, but to share your experience, or we wouldn't know. Okay, we're going to turn now to the third section. We're really going to focus now on the solutions, lessons learned from your research, things that you've learned that we could begin to apply, that each of you are seeing out of your own work. So I'm going to start with you, Raki.
Sure.
So addressing gender-based violence in the workplace, it requires involvement, action on the part of the private sector and the public sector, both. So what are your key recommendations that you would propose to employers in the garment sector to start?
Sure. I think right away, just to provide basic conditions for safe and non-hostile working environment by making all sexually laced comments, jokes, innuendos, double-meaning words immediately punishable at all levels, from recruiters to co-workers to top management, and to implement sexual harassment and labor laws meaningfully and not superficially. And we already have evidence from one of the leading export firms in India, where women workers say that because management does not tolerate, quote-unquote, any loose talk, and takes action immediately when there is any kind of loose talk, they feel safe and they enjoy their work. However, the same firm does not follow the same system in all of its factories and all of the units that it owns, where workers have complained of violence and rampant sexual harassment, extreme stress and unhappiness. So our recommendation is that rather than having one showcase factory that is compliant with all laws, the employers should ensure that all the units, all their factories are compliant. The other thing that our research found is in North India particularly, out of the 65 tasks that we managed in a garment factory, women are employed in only 3: thread cutting, handwork like embroidery, and a little bit of tailoring. While the first 2 are lower paying, they employ 99.9% women. And tailoring, which pays a little bit more, only employs 15 to 25% women. And all the supervisors and managers are male. Right? So what this means is that women are coming out to work, but they're being incorporated at the lowest rungs in the lowest paying jobs. And so therefore businesses and governments really have to step up and do their bit to support the women by training them, skilling them, and helping them to move up the jobs hierarchy and the supply chain. And there is evidence that this works because another leading exporter in the area did engage in a program of skilling and training the women to become supervisors, and they got promoted with a 30-35% wage hike. And the company reported that the promotions resulted in higher self-regard, and it also increased the productivity of these workers by up to 50%. So there are things that the businesses could do immediately in their environments to both create safe and dignified working spaces, as well as help women to skill and move up the hierarchy.
Thanks very much. So let's turn now to the public sector.
Yes.
So what can governments do, government actors, agencies, et cetera? So what's your advice on that?
You know, it's unfortunate that in 2019, we're still talking about provisioning of basic amenities and infrastructure for workers. So the first thing that at least the Indian government, the Bangladeshi government, Cambodian, Indonesian governments need to do is to create affordable housing options for women who come to industrial areas, working women's hostels, so that provide for childcare or creche facilities so they can leave their children in safe environments. And, following up with Amar, really increase the investment in safe, reliable, and affordable transportation in the industrial areas. That's really the key. Then women that we interviewed have told us that they want the government to ensure that the public walkways, the pathways that go between the industrial areas and their homes are well lit. That doesn't cost much. And to ensure that there's a public life, vendors, these are not isolated stretches. And the other thing the women are demanding is increased police patrolling, and to have not just male but female police officers in those patrolling. Otherwise, sometimes it's the male police officers that end up harassing them. The other thing is that the Sexual Harassment Act of 2013 provided for something called the formation of the Local Complaints Committee. What this means is that if you don't have in your factories an internal complaints committee, you have an alternative mechanism at the district level where you could go to register your complaints. Now, although the Act provides for it, they're barely formed, barely functioning, so the government really needs to step up and increase the formation of these local complaints committee at the district levels and ensure their proper functioning and monitoring. The other thing, just like skilling and promoting women helps them, women have also shared that when they are trained and have access and knowledge to knowing about their rights, and they start perceiving themselves as rights rights-bearing citizens and rights-bearing persons, it really has an impact with how they deal with violence across various spaces, whether it's the workspace, the public space, or home and community. So our recommendation is that the local government should partner with the local industry and community-based organizations and really organize training camps in workers' colonies where they live to educate them about their rights and also about sexual harassment laws and grievance redressal procedures especially. And then, of course, the best way to, I'm a trade unionist, of course, I would say let's form more unions. The government needs to encourage and facilitate the formation and registration of unions and to do it in time-bound manner so it doesn't allow the employers to engage in union-busting activities. Women have actually shared with us that their strength and confidence goes up when they come out of the isolation of their homes. They're working with other women in groups. The comradeship, the friendship really gives them strength and confidence and helps them to deal with all kinds of issues that they face in a patriarchal society. So not just, I think the message is it's not just economic empowerment in isolation that works, but really following up on Joanna's comment about intersectionality, we really do need to address this in an intersectional manner so that it empowers women across social and economic areas. Last, the federal government has introduced paid leave for women in government employment who face sexual harassment. We would like to ask the government to extend that to the private sector and to women universally, wherever they might be working, whether it's in the unorganized sector or the organized sector. But paid leave, I know that Canada now has paid domestic violence leave. We are still dealing with trying to get paid sexual harassment leave. And I think that would be really important because women, when they complain, get fired or they get victimized. So it would really help if they could have access to some paid leave to deal with not just the violence and the trauma of violence, but also stigma. Because in our society, a woman, I mean, it's rampant victim blaming right from the family members and husbands and, friends and co-workers to also the public institutions. So those are some of the things that the government could really do right away without much cost. I know the governments always think about cost. These are all there and really don't cost much for the government to do.
Super, thanks. Thanks. I'm going to turn back to Joanna. So coding right aims to influence policies and programs and practices. Can you talk first about what you think could be done at the community level, community-driven initiatives that you've seen that might actually be very effective?
Sure. At Coding Rights, we are not Mangueira, but we also use creativity to address issues that are sensitive, sometimes need healing, deconstruction processes, and information sharing of very technical and complicated terms. So we work with art and creativity to help with the information sharing of digital security tactics in this period in which we have a lot of attention, very short attention gap, no? In this sense, so beyond giving trainings, workshops, we have developed media content to improve the outreach of security practices and the culture of security. This is one example of a project that's called Safer Sisters. It's a series of GIFs that, in a very short loop, give you some information about digital security. This one is about chat apps, and it's comparing the different kinds of chat apps that people use, from WhatsApp to Telegram and Signal, and then pointing out. And the idea is that you can share that in chat apps or social media and have like this comprised information in the form of pills so people can perhaps change their practices. We have another one about passwords, strong passwords, how to deal if you're being targeted by hate speech online, and so on and so forth. This is one example of the project that we had. Another one, the older one, was the zine called Safer Nudes, we know that, unfortunately, non-consensual dissemination of intimate images is one of the most reported forms of technology-enabled gender violence. Sometimes some people call it revenge porn. I don't like the terminology because it's not porn and not revenge. There is no consent on all this. And we find out that a lot of the content addressing the issue was actually blaming the victims. And we decided to do the zine in a very do-it-yourself format with a feminist perspective to the issue, considering that selfies, nudes, and other forms of self-representation can also be political gestures, and that is our right to decide if we want to share a picture with whom and what and how. No, so we bring this feminist perspective to that debate or phenomenon. It was a meme also in Brazil, send nudes and everything, but also gave some hints. Okay, if you want to do this, know more about this, but don't feel ashamed if it leaks. It's not your fault. Your trust has been betrayed. So that was the approach also. And then we also have other projects in which we use imagination to envision transfeminist futures. How technologies would look like if we have feminist values embedded into it. So we are playing with an oracle in the format of a tarot deck to help people envision alternative futures, transfeminist futures. And because also most of the technologies that we use are developed by men in the Silicon Valley, a very particular identity. And perhaps if the technologies were taught differently, we also would be less exposed to other sorts of violences that we have.
So thank you. I'm just going to ask you, because what you're doing at Coding Rights, you can also use these digital platforms to strengthen the law and access to justice. So can you give some examples of how you can promote rights and access to justice using some of these digital platforms?
Sure. At Coding Rights, we developed a platform that extracts all the draft bills from the National Congress that's called Radar Legislativo, Legislative Radar. And all the collects all the draft bills that are related to digital rights. Mm-hmm. And it can be filtered per issue, like access, privacy, freedom of expression, and gender. And if we filter by gender, we'll see that by now we have 25 draft proposals of laws related to gender and technology. Most of them are related to gender-based violence. And we also do an analysis of the quality of those proposals, thinking about the human rights, but also if they attack the open, decentralized nature of the internet. And making those analyses, we saw that most of them are harmful and probably not proposed by people informed by women or people that are attacked. So the point that I want to make is that sometimes proposing a legislation cannot actually just make the situation worse, leading to surveillance and breaking the internet. I don't know. But then last year, we have produced a report on technology-enabled violence against women for the consultations of the UN Special Rapporteur of Violence Against Women, which also inspired a resolution on the topic that was sponsored by the Canadian government. And in this report, we propose a series of recommendations for both governments and the private sector to deal with the issue. We need to also consider that the private sector plays a big role, because in the end, those are the platforms that are deciding if hate speech is going to remain online, if feminist content is going to be censored because there are breasts all over, and things like that. So also, I consider that some kind of censorship, and censorship is a violence as well. But particularly for the public sector, there are more recommendations that we frame in the report, but I would like to highlight 3 as the most important ones. First of them is pretty much related to what Haki was saying, that states shall promote access to justice and have capacity building and awareness raising within law enforcement agents and the judiciary, meaning that police officers, prosecutors, judges must be trained to be able to deal with those cases without promoting the feeling of impunity and the re-victimization of those who are attacked using technology. The other recommendation is that states shall also promote data protection and encryption and anonymity. I know this can be tricky sometimes when we talk about encryption, anonymity, and gender-based violence, but what we have observed is that, as I mentioned in the example of Women United Against Bolsonaro, in a wide variety of attacks, they use a wide variety of attacks that use technology. We see that people perpetuating gender violence are taking advantage of the massive amount of data about ourselves that is collected and available in the digital environments. So promoting data protection is essential. Today we just launched a report about consent to our data bodies, trying to transpose some of the feminist debates around consent to the consent used in the data protection debate. And as Sarah Ahmed said, consent is about the ability to say no. So we want to promote the debate on what's our ability to say no in those platforms that are led by monopolistic companies, no? And we just agree. So have a bigger debate about privacy, security, encryption, anonymity is also important.
Super. Thanks, Joanna. So, Amar, I'm going to turn to you now and go back to transportation. So, from your work, what are some concrete ways that transportation can be made more equal gender safe?
Yeah, this might sound surprising, but before we talk about concrete solutions, what I discovered to my surprise was that when you put this evidence, some of the numbers I discussed with you, in front of senior policymakers, they're surprised. They're like, really? Is this really happening in our city? The first meeting I had with a senior official in the Punjab Mass Transit Authority in Lahore challenged me and said, no, we don't really have a harassment problem. And when I said, like, what are you talking about? He said, well, I have evidence for that. And I said, sure, let's see that evidence. So they pulled up like last 5 years of complaint data, and out of about 15,000 cases, they had 5 or 6 instances of women actually reporting harassment or assault. And I said, well, that's your first problem. You have a reporting problem. You have a social problem with a taboo and so on. So I think the first challenge for us researchers, and this goes back to what you said, Margaret, at the beginning, is that we as researchers have a very important role to play in putting this issue on the agenda. Because unless you do that, then the rest of this is just, it won't make a difference. And when it comes to actual solutions, I think there's a range of things. Our approach was basically, instead of us coming up with solutions or testing with randomized controlled trials and whatnot, we thought, well, why don't we ask the women themselves, the ones who are riding public transport with our app? And some of the most frequent things, exactly what you were saying, was the first thing they said was, we want patrolling, we want enforcement, somebody to watch the men as we go about our daily business. Other things were somewhat small and might sound trivial, but they are important. Where, for example, in the Shadara station, which is a big transit hub outside of Lahore, when a woman gets off or anybody gets off of the bus rapid transit line, in order to take the local bus to go into the city, there is about a 50-meter or 100-meter walk. And that's supposed to be a sidewalk, but it's actually littered by vendors. So when a woman walks through it, she has to walk. First, she has to walk on the road, which is hazardous. And then there's all sorts of rickshaw drivers and taxi drivers stopping throughout the way, saying, do you want to come, you want to take a ride or whatever. So that becomes a problem itself. So it's a small adjustment to be made where the location of the bus stop could be moved closer or within the transit stop. That helps the problem, and that doesn't really cost much. And then similarly, as I said, the queuing thing is very important. So in the Lahore mass transit system and the new railway line that they're putting out, there is developed a norm. They tell me it's not a law, it's a norm that women queue up and take the front side of the bus, and they queue up outside of the front, and they're like law enforcement, both men and women, who actually ensure that the queuing is segregated and that it's done properly. Although that's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because as my sisters would always remind me, like, why do you want to put us in cages? Why don't you have actually reprimand perpetrators rather than putting us in cages? So that's a fair argument. So it's a double-edged sword. Other things that they talked about was to put in posters in vehicles that I see a lot here in Washington D.C., in Boston, where I live now. Posters reminding everybody about the local laws, and like there's cameras watching you and things like that. And then they also said we should do like break the taboo a little bit and have like mass awareness campaigns, and also have awareness raising or like behavior trainings for drivers and conductors who interact with female passengers, because that's often what we found in our data was that drivers themselves could be perpetrators. So back in the 1990s, in the minivans that used to run or still run all across Pakistan, there was a law passed that said the front 2 seats would be reserved for women. But then they tell me, a lot of women tell me that in itself becomes a problem when they're in close proximity to the driver. And there's actually some interesting behavioral interventions that colleagues at the World Bank have done in Mexico and other places, where they would actually start a training where have the drivers or whoever the trainees are write the name of their sister or their wife, and then use that name to kind of relate a story of a woman who was harassed or was constantly facing a problem, like making them realize what their actions, how would they feel if somebody in their family had that. So the point is that we don't really need to spend millions and millions of dollars to do these things. It's actually about the intent and about raising the awareness. And so I think conversations like these and working with local partners is extremely important.
So thank you. Just so I can come back. So there can be community level or smaller actions can have a big difference, but there's also a lot of implications for the economy as a whole. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the policy change and some of the economic impacts and things that concrete ideas for that.
Right. Maybe this is because I hang out with economists quite a bit at the Kennedy School, but my belief is that unless you mainstream this issue in an economics policy conversation, unless you get the Minister of Finance to be worrying about this issue, governments will not make the required investments, and that's a hard thing to do. So part of our attempt is to situate all of this in the context of broader discussions on economic growth. The GROW program here at IDRC actually helped us clarify a lot of our thinking around this. But basically, the way I see it is that mobility is, like, in a rapidly urbanizing world, is very central to anything that you do, whether that's accessing a job or just entertainment, just going to the park in the evening. It's very, very important to a person. And then, as I said earlier, because women have peculiar needs, unless we make those additional investments, women will not be able to access as many jobs. So think about a 1-hour commute radius, for instance. If you're walking, as I said, more than twice, women are walking. how many jobs can you access in a 1-hour commute radius versus being able to ride a mass transit line? It's a massive difference. So if you can improve the matching between workers and firms, workers in theory are able to access better paying jobs, cover bigger distance. That should, at the macro level, have productivity benefits for society, for the region, for the city. And that is where I think we could get economic policymakers interested. But in order to document this, we need a lot more effort, more investment in research studies that help clarify that and make that case.
Super. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists. I think you've got a pretty good taste of the research that they're doing, the context, and some of the solutions that can come out of the work that they've been doing. So we have 25 minutes now to open it up and have a conversation and take questions and delve down a little bit deeper into all of these issues. So it's over to you now as the audience, and we invite your questions in either official language at the microphones. And we have 2 microphones, one here and one there. And again, there's headsets available at the back. And don't be shy. So, nous invitons à poser.
So please come to a microphone and ask a question in either official language. First question, fine, good.
If you don't mind, just introducing yourself.
I'm Jane Parpart. I've been involved in teaching and researching on gender and development since the 80s. And thank you for a really fascinating talk. I was very glad to be hearing about the conditions for women in the workplace at the less skilled levels. But I think I just wanted to throw in that we also have to think about the fact that gender inequality exists at all levels. For instance, in the top 500 companies in the world, this is the women who are the heads of those companies are less than 5%. And in the high-tech world, when that was first starting, women were like 26, 27%. They're now 24%. Large numbers of women go in and just find that it's a boys' club. It's just not designed for women. The language, the body language, everything, the everyday practices. So these are at the level of highly, and it's the same in politics. It's very much still a man's game. Mm-hmm. And so how we change this, I think this reminds us that it's not just a question of bringing up women who are disadvantaged, but we have to talk about the problem of gender inequality at all levels, mm-hmm. in all institutions, in business, in government, at every level and in every endeavor. And it seems to me that if we don't remember that, then we can think, well, we just can find some nice solution to help these women who never got over third grade, mm-hmm. so now they need more schooling or things like that. It's everywhere, and we mm-hmm. need to think about the gender problems as universal and global.
Yep, thank you. Was there a specific question that you wanted to pose to the panel, or just a comment on that? What do you think about that? Okay.
Agree with it is a short answer.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, please.
My name is Sofia Trevino, and I come from Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WIGO. So, Raki, thank you very much for we need more trade unions. I totally agree with that, the social movement from the bottom down. So my question is to Amar and Joanna. Following that thought, have you, Amar, or what is your perspective in Lahore with HomeNet Pakistan, who have and are currently organizing and achieving great policy changes as a movement, as a social movement from the bottom up? And Joanna, in regards to the online economy, I work very closely with the domestic workers sector. And one part that I am worried about, and I want your perspective on this, in terms of online economy, is for the care workers and domestic workers and the proliferation that we're seeing with applications that they are going into an employer's home, closed doors, And I mean, it is a very gray part in terms of policy. So the anonymity on these applications, I was worried when I heard this, because I get it when you see online economy as this like this. I'm trying to see, like, going a step beyond these relationships using applications. When you go into a employer-employee relationship, and care economy and domestic workers are, I think, a group that are very vulnerable in this online economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let's, while the rest of you are getting your questions together, we'll put it back to the panel. Just some general comments from any of you on the first, other than agreeing, maybe I heard you, Raki, on our first comment, and then I'll turn. You got some specifics here to Amar and Joanna. So on the first point, Raki.
Sure. I think, yes, of course, I totally agree with that. And I think the current, particularly in India and South Asia, we saw that the Me Too movement really has, and India's own version of the Me Too movement has really brought to the fore this conversation that it's the, I mean, of course, the US version, the fact that it's the women from educated, middle class and elite backgrounds who should be protected by their privileges are also not protected, all right? And the fact, but there the inequality in access to, because Me Too really has been a social media driven movement, and the women that we work with in the industrial and agricultural sectors don't have that kind of access and don't have those kinds of privileges. So while I agree to protect them, even the women who are reporting this harassment and coming out in the open and naming their perpetrators and sharing their stories are facing a backlash. But they may have a little, you know, what I'm trying to say is that they may have a little bit more social support and family support to protect them through their lean unemployment days. But the women at the bottom of the rung don't have that kind of protection to fall back on, much more vulnerable. They're working in the fields of those landlords where they are, you know, so their livelihood really depends on that. They're much more vulnerable. The structural inequalities need to be addressed. The fact that a lot of this violence is also has a caste angle to it, can have a religious angle to it. We've seen, you know, the kind of lynchings of Muslims in India, of Dalits in India at the moment. So I think while I agree with you that women across all social backgrounds, yes, because this is a patriarchal society that we're dealing with, and we've made strides, we've made dents in addressing some of the patriarchy, but we've got long ways to go. But also to remember that women at the bottom of the ladder are much more vulnerable, less able to do the reporting, even though they are facing a higher level and more brutal kinds of violence. So while I agree, I also think we need a more disaggregated approach to it.
Anybody would you like to add anything to that?
Just a quick point to that. Actually, when we started our work on transportation, our hypothesis was that these issues that we're talking about affect low-income and middle-income women who can't drive to work or don't have a private vehicle. But as actually we did more research, we found that even women who are driving face issues with, you know, bad driving behavior, lewd gestures, and this and that. I mean, there's all sorts of nasty things going out there. Even if you are a quote-unquote empowered woman with a good job and have your own behind the wheel. So I think absolutely. And then the other angle that was, you know, perhaps not surprising to this audience is that regardless of how you dress up, whether you're dressing modestly with a hijab or you're in Western attire going out with friends or whatever, you are almost equally likely to be harassed on the street. And so that again is a sort of in a weird way, sort of an equalizer. So that also broke, again, initially our hypothesis.
So you can, would you like to, or you can move on? Do you want me to, do you want anything else to add?
Can just add a little bit on women in ICTs. I totally agree. And As I said, I think it's an issue because the way platforms are formed, they bring the values from those who are developing it. Technologies are not neutral. There was this myth that technologies are neutral, but more and more we see it's not the case. So, of course, who develop them affect the way we interact with technology. So that's why we are doing this exercise of speculative futures. But on the other hand, there are more women coming together as collectives or companies fostering women in the development spaces of technologies. And I think if we don't shift this, it's gonna be hard to shift the paradigm. Like Facebook was created by Mark was a student at Harvard that created Facebook to make a ranking of pretty women. So that's the basis of Facebook, the biggest platform in which we are doing our activism and social networks and everything. Of course, there are lots of values that we don't like there. So why we are, as feminists, are going to remain in this structure? No? Yeah.
Super, thank you. Okay, then the second question that we had was very specific. I mean, you can all answer to it, I think, but you were all, well, Joanna and Mara, I think, were specifically singled out, but Raki, I think you started, you too. So, second question.
You'll be glad to know that we actually partnered with HomeNet to do some of the data collection. They have very good networks in local communities, especially with home-based and domestic workers, and they were some of the focus groups that we ran were actually with their help. And so they were definitely part and parcel of this. But it was really also, at some level, very sad that when we talked to some really low-income, domestic workers and women, they said that, initially their reaction was like, why are you talking to us about this stuff? Like, talk to us about food and about, like more basic stuff. This is just a way of life for us. And yes, this is an important issue, but, if I were to rank order situations that I face, what I face in the public sphere is the least of my worries, which was really sad in some way, but makes the point that, in the grand scheme of things, it affects all segments of societies in different ways.
Joanna or Rafi? Joanna?
It's a hard one. This Uberization of work is a challenge, no? You see, in one hand, more flexibility, choice, independency to get a work, but then precarity also elevates and a lot of security risks. I think that the answer to it's a multi-layer. It's not only through the technology. You need to keep fighting for better enforcement of labor law and connect those debates to the technology debate as well. In one hand, and the other hand, so make the companies that develop those technologies also be binding by that. And it's an ongoing, it's complicated.
Sophia, just if I could add to it, working with the workers at that level, once they start to understand, it's like domestic workers, they have their own referral systems, right? Even when they don't go through the apps, let's start with that. They'll be able to tell each other, don't go into this home, they don't pay you the rate, or they make you do more work than what you signed up for, or they don't pay on time, etc., etc. So they have their own referral system. I think one way of addressing, even though employment through apps increases the anonymity and breaks up this organic sort of social grouping that the domestic workers and home-based care workers would have otherwise. I think one way of addressing, and here I'm thinking as an organizer, is if they are aware of how this technology works and how to hold the aggregating platform. For example, Uber, when Uber drivers started unionizing, no one thought it would be possible to hold the platform accountable and to give them employee-employee status and those kinds of workers' rights. I think since we can't turn the clock back, technology is with us. I think as organizers, it's our task to really understand how technology works and how we can subvert it or put it to the use of workers so they can then use it to also empower themselves and to fight for their rights. And I think that's where a lot of our work, really for future of work kind of work, really lies, is really understanding the technology and then in simple ways helping the workers to understand it. And believe me, sometimes our workers are far better at understanding how the technology works than even some of us do. So I don't think we need to be afraid of technology. We need to learn how to harness it for promoting the labor rights and for equalizing the power relations between employer and employees, or where such a relationship doesn't exist, how to try and establish one. That would be my response.
Great, thank you. We're going to take a couple more questions. We've got one here and one there, so yes, please.
Bonjour, mon nom est Brigitte Demers.
I'm Brigitte Demers. First of all, thank you to IDRC for this conference, which informs on equality. Joanna Badouin. I'm very interested in this topic today. I'm a novice in all those technology. We hear about violence against women and inequalities in many areas. But briefly, recently, I've seen that there's some platforms where you can say anonymous. So I understand that the earth is round, so that's good for me. I have an aunt who is a very militant feminist, and I asked her a question on Facebook. She said, well, I'll call you. I refused to respond on Facebook, so this is my question. And I know almost nothing in technology. Are there ways for very militant feminists to do small actions in an environment? We say a citizen can use less water, can produce less waste. So what can you do as citizens on those media platforms in order to take action in accordance with our values for gender equality?
We have some other people, so I'm going to take the questions quickly, and then we'll put them back to the panel. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name's Sheila Rao, and I'm a social anthropologist and lecturer at Carleton University, and I do research on gender in sub-Saharan Africa. My question, thank you very much for the panel. It was very interesting, and from an anthropological perspective, it was great to hear all about the women's experiences included in the research. And you've also addressed some of the structural issues in each of the contexts. My question to all of you would be around what your experiences or strategies might be to include male counterparts in your context. What kinds of experiences or research have you done in terms of the drivers, the male drivers, co-workers, middle managers, heads of companies, the technology designers, those kinds of sort of behind the doors, behind the scenes, people who actually kind of guide the structures or develop the structures in which we're actually experiencing all these different forms of violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take both of you, if that's okay, quickly, and then we'll come back to you, and then we'll do a rapid round. Okay, please.
I'll be as quick as possible. My name is Katie Feenan, and I work for an organization called the Public Policy Forum. So we convene, and we are a think tank. So recently I worked on an event where we talked about cyber harassment and directly sort of how it impacts women in political life. So my question is for Joanna as well. I'm happy you brought up one comment I also have is I'm happy you brought up the issue of anonymity, because just to add to what you said, Facebook and all of these platforms are created, as you said, in an environment in the U.S. where freedom of speech is the utmost. And for anonymity for women and intersection and people in other countries, especially countries where freedom of speech isn't the possible is really important. So I just wanted to add that. The other question, the question I have really is your comment that you made about your recommendation about policing and enforcement. I'm curious if you have any examples you can provide as to countries where they are actually moving this issue forward, because I know in Canada we have a challenge with policing as it relates to cyber harassment specifically. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, and then over here.
Hi, I'm Kendra. I'm also from WeGo. So I just have a quick comment and a question. So as we know, 92% of women that work in developing countries work in informal jobs. So I would just kind of encourage us in this conversation about gender-based violence and work to think about informal workplaces as well. So that's private homes, that's public spaces, and different forms of harassment that people can face in those spaces. So economic violence, psychological violence. So that's just my comment. And like Sophia, I have a particular question for Raki. So my question was, you talked a lot about working around improving working conditions in factories, and I was just curious because we're focused a lot on informal home-based workers, whether you've had any experience bringing those two factory-based and home-based together, and challenges associated with bringing like employers and subcontractors on board in that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. My name is Hassan. I'm an economist and a public policy professional. Thank you very much for coming here and giving us this informative session. My question is directed towards Amar and Raki. Your research and your work is focused more on the urban areas, and you've got some really good ideas about how to reduce the violence against women in urban areas. But in Pakistan and in India, the population is more rural. So I just wanted to know about, and as Raki, you pointed out, there are other social factors that are at play. So what, from your research and your work, what do you think are the ways to bring about long-term change in attitudes in the rural economies or in the rural areas? Thank you.
All right, we're getting quite the list. Last question, please.
And I'm an independent consultant. I would like to know what, if you're looking at what the women who have been victimized, when they go back to their home, in their household, what kind of support they're getting from the men and also from the women in their families. And are there any things, if you're doing such research, on solutions that the women are families are taking? This brings me to think about the male perpetrators. I'm always asking myself, they have sisters, they have daughters, and they all have a mother. Like, are these not sufficient to make them be aware, like when you're victimizing another woman, you are relating to this? I find one of the solutions that was brought forward today, although I agree with it, I find it sad that raising awareness about JDB or any kind of mistreatment of women can affect the bottom line, and that's a solution. In itself, I find it sad, but how many more cases do we need to have for it to become mainstream? And one thing Amar raised is people who have a car, live a good life, they're the ones who are making policies. Can they really relate to what women go through?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we have actually quite a few questions. So what I propose that we do is, so we'll just go starting with Joanna, because one of the first questions went, but where you were asked something specifically, if you could comment quickly or anything else, and then we'll just ask all three of you, sort of as a way to kind of wrap up. And if we don't get to everything, there, people can always come up afterwards and have a little bit of a offline conversation here. So why don't we do our best? And I'll start with you, Joanna. A couple of questions went directly to you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to mix the question on feminists interacting in the platforms with the anonymity debate and the law enforcement through policing. So when we started to interact in the internet, we wouldn't put our names in that. We would enter, I don't know, chat rooms or things like that, like Garfield or Crazy Cat. But there was a shift on it, and now everybody have your name, your faces, your family, your babies, everything exposed and connecting many layers of our identities in one platform or in one company that owns many platforms, like the case of Facebook with WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook itself. So that's the situation now. And we still need to operate in this situation because those platforms became a place for political struggle and to push our agendas as well. But we can be critical and know what you want to share, with whom, how, and what's your communication tactics with it, in one hand. And in the other hand, there is the increase of more autonomous technologies, feminist servers. They're like growing and growing. So there is also a need to foster those alternative solutions and technologies that sometimes they don't work super perfect, as Google will be. You need to be patient and collaborate, because then there are other values as well. We don't need to hush as much as the technology is pushing us to hush. So there is this balance that you can do operating in and fostering another environment. So I'm not saying if a feminist quit Facebook, but maybe do it. And but then check out other autonomous initiatives and feminist initiatives, because any help is a good help. And Latin America is growing. It's a very fertile region for cyber feminists. There are many initiatives on that. I'm happy to share later on. Policing, law enforcement, good examples. I don't have any. Every time we had to deal with cases and go to the police, it was a mess, because they re-victimized the victim. Like all the, as I mentioned, all the historical structural challenges to deal with the police on issues about gender-based violence will be in your face when you come and talk about digital or technology-enabled forms of violence. And even with another layer, which is, this is just the internet. As I said, it's very important to frame that this is a continuum. The violence that is virtual hits your physical life. So this is one challenge. Another challenge is for law enforcement, if they pay attention on what you're saying, to know the procedures for investigation. For instance, there was this case of a woman that was being threatened by a guy with intimate images, and she went to the police and said, I'm being threatened. The police said, show me the pictures. And I was like, I don't want to show the pictures. Why do you need to see my naked pictures? So she went back home. So we understand that, just to wrap up, we need to think also the issue in a multi-layer. One, it's what the state can do, and of course you need to educate and create awareness of the law enforcement agents. But on the other hand, we can operate with technical solutions, so that's where some hints on digital security play a role. We can operate with the platforms. Actually, many times the solution came with us calling people or interacting with people from those platforms. which is not the best way. They should have a procedure that doesn't need people knowing people to solve the issue. And the most important is the community aspect, having a network of support. You're being attacked by hate speech, have your community helping you, have your community building bots as well. The right is very good on technology and having bots attacking you. We should also start to think about that, like using technology and community to protect ourselves and to promote help, support, hugs, and all that.
Thank you. Amar, any wrap-ups?
Yes,
Yeah.
on the point about male reactions, including more men, I think there were two questions about that. If you look around, even right now in this room, I count about out of 80 people in the room, I count exactly a dozen men, which is like less than 1 in every 6. And I've seen this in Washington and in London and in all other places wherever there's a panel like this. So we're outnumbered. So I think there's a need to include more men into the conversations. And then in our research, we basically used a few men basically as a baseline. So in our app data collection effort, if a man and a woman take the same public transport route right about the same time of the day, how are their reactions different? So that was really helpful to us. And then in terms of the reactions that men have to like women who face these kinds of issues, one of the most disturbing things I found was that a lot of the biggest reasons that a lot of women don't report or share this with their family, harassment on the street, is that the first reaction their parents will have is, stop going to school, stop going to work, like just stay home. So it's like a really regressive situation for them, and they find themselves in a catch-22. And on the point that Hassan raised about the rural areas, that's absolutely critical. There's actually new work coming out of Harvard EPOD, where I work with Asim Khaja, is a new paper now, which actually finds that in skill acquisition training, they had this massive skill program for women. They found that there are what he calls glass walls, which is basically a woman's likelihood of going 500 meters outside of her village or like her own sphere is not just a physical barrier to her going to the next village. It's actually a much deeper and deeply entrenched social issue. So women's mobility, even in rural areas, is restricted, even though we might think that the communities are tighter knit. But just being in your own village, in your own domain, is very comforting, and leaving that is extremely difficult. So it has all sorts of very deep-rooted issues that we need to think of.
Yeah. I'm sure we're running out of time, so very quickly, to Sheila's question, yes, we did include interviews with male co-workers, with some of the supervisors, line supervisors in the garment industry. We had security guards, some of the subcontractors that our researchers spoke to. We didn't get up to middle management and top management, except I did do one interview with one of the factory owners. Usually they don't like to speak to researchers. And it is a problem. We recognize it's a problem. And I think, and there are already organizations that are working, with the men to address gender-based violence. What we found and what the women, because we did both segregated focus group discussions and mixed group discussions on this issue. And, it's true that, you require some segregated spaces and some mixed spaces to try and address these issues. It's a deeply entrenched, as Amara said, deeply entrenched social cultural ideas. It's going to take some time, but by the same token, where women are pushing back, and I think that's where some of the solution lies. Again, as an organizer, I don't believe in this top-down training. It's really where the workers themselves understand and push back is when there is a change in the attitudes. So, for example, one of the ways we're trying to address is what we're calling training in everyday negotiations. So when the manager or a co-worker is engaging in behavior that you find uncomfortable, what can be your reaction? How can you push back without turning it into a confrontation that then ends up with you getting terminated. So we are thinking creatively, but also allowing for women to come up with, and if you just nudge them a little bit, they are able to come up with solutions on their own. So I think that's what I could give you more examples, but we could talk after the panel. We did include them. So another focus as a follow-up of the research phase of our project is the advocacy phase, and we're already in conversation with the police department and the labor department, because that's where a lot of the sensitization needs to take place, and the local complaints committee, because again, they tend to think that women are just coming up. I mean, one of the interviews, they actually said to us, just from the body language of the complainant, we can tell whether she's filing a genuine case or a false case. And you're not even a trained psychologist. How can you do that, right? From what she's wearing and her body language. I mean, so we have a long way to go. Very quickly, Kendra, your question about home-based workers. What we tried to do, I know that WIGO in India is already doing a simultaneous project on home-based workers, so we didn't actually focus on that. But what we did try to do is trace the supply chain of the factories into the homes, and we found a change in that. In the last 10 years, it seems that the companies have brought more and more of the work in-house for quality control, which is why you're finding more and more women coming into factory spaces. The women who we spoke to in the home-based work who were doing any kind of garment work were doing it because they either had small children whom they couldn't leave anywhere because there's no childcare arrangement, or whose husbands don't want them to go out to work, or for some other health reasons, so health, social reasons, children. These are the women who are confining themselves to home-based work. By this, but the other side of this is that one of the women who was confined to the home said that the day that her husband has his day off is the day that she goes out to work. She doesn't want to deal with him at home. Right? So there are ways that women are challenging it. We do have a long way to go. But in terms of subcontractors, believe it or not, at least in the Gurgaon belt where our research was focused, most of the subcontractors are women. Most of the subcontractors who are even taking the women from those neighborhood, the street corners, recruiting them as daily wage workers and taking them to factories are women. But women from a different regional and caste location. So there are other kinds of social factors and social oppressions at play. And something that I wasn't able to speak about earlier, but intersectionality, really, it's been very hard. We tried very hard to unpack, but it's very difficult because if you're a Dalit woman who's come from a rural area, from a particular geographical location, then the violence that you're facing, all of these biases are fusing into the violence that is being perpetrated on you. How do you unpack it, right? Even access to toilets and bathrooms in the working class colonies where they live, they tend to restrict their use because they're from a particular caste or a particular location. So unpacking some of this, and what do you say, how do you address because most of the tailors and menfolk in the garment industries are from a particular belt where they have had historical skills, right? So they were weavers. When weaving got taken over by the factory-based mills, then they became bespoke tailors. When mass production sort of made it uneconomical for us to get full clothes stitched, they came into the garment industry. Now, who are they? These are mostly Muslim workers, and their women are not going to be allowed to come out to work. So there are a lot of these social issues. It's very complicated at the ground level when one has to really walk many of these thin lines. Complicated, but not unsurmountable.
Last word.
Last word.
Just pick one.
Victimized women and support. Jackie's question. Again, very complicated. So there are some families who support them. There are some families who don't support the women. But women do say that they find most of the support primarily with their girlfriends first. That's where they'll talk about it. That's where they'll vent. That's how, in fact, many of our researchers found the people whom they were going to interview, is when they were just walking with them home and they saw a cluster of women talking. You know, that's how they also counsel each other. That's where they help them to say that this needs to be reported and we'll stand with you. By the same token, if a woman does it without any prep work, the other women on the shop floor don't support them. So a lot of internalized patriarchy is at work. So we don't have one straightforward answer. It's a complicated. So we really have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. But the answer, part of the answer as organizers, is really more awareness and more confidence. You know, once they see that they can ask questions and someone will hear them, it really helps them to then step up and be more confident the next time around, or to confront the perpetrator, or to find ways of addressing it at home, to do practice runs as to how will you raise it with your family members without losing your job. Because for many women, stepping out of the house is really important. Stepping out of that cage for 8 or 10 hours a day is very, very important for them. So no straightforward answers, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, all three of you, hugely. Thank you for the questions, which were tremendous, and I think we just sort of scratched the surface, but a fabulous panel with insights and research experience and evidence. So we have a long way to go, but you are all helping move us in the right direction. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn now. We have a real pleasure. Idrc works very closely with Global Affairs Canada, of course, and we have Kathleen Flynn Dapa here, who's the Assistant Director for the Violence Prevention from Global Affairs, and she's just going to give us a few words. And they had a sister panel, I guess you would say, this morning at Global Affairs. And so, please, Kathleen.
Hello, good afternoon. Merci de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you today to take part in this marvelous event.
International Women's Day. It's an opportunity to measure progress and to call attention to so much work that still needs to be done. This afternoon, we've had the privilege to hear from this panel of distinguished researchers. And the theme for this year's International Women's Day is Think Equal, Build Smart, Innovate for Change. And as we all know in this room, research, data, evidence, and especially research that's led from the South is absolutely critical to this agenda. Combattre la violence basée sur
fight against violence based on sex in a very specific way is fundamental for gender equality. This violation of human rights is a challenge that has enormous consequences, not just for girls, but also for society, prosperity, peace, and development. And this is the reason why the feminist international policy puts so much emphasis on the elimination of sexual violence under all its forms and all contexts. We have integrated this priority in our international development platform. In our approach to deliver human assistance, and in our Canada Assistance Plan, which is devoted to women.
1 in 3 women and girls experience violence in their lifetime. And violence against women and girls happens in every country, in every society, rural and urban areas, at home, in schools, on the streets, at work in the formal and the informal economy, on the internet, in places like refugee camps. And too often, women and girls, violence against women and girls is normalized and goes unpunished. Today's panel discussion is so important because it has highlighted the lived experiences of violence, the structural drivers of violence, and most importantly, we've started to talk about what works to address it in these 3 specific settings where violence and harassment are rampant. It was striking to hear the data that each of you shared, the experiences each of you shared. And this contextual data and evidence about what works in different settings is essential to eliminating gender-based violence. There is so much to take away from today's panel. It's always good when you feel like there's not enough time. And to complement it, I just want to share a few examples of what we at Global Affairs Canada have been doing internationally in some of these areas. We've talked a lot about digital technologies today, and they have the potential to play an important role in advancing gender equality and empowering women and girls. But the benefits of these technologies are undermined so much by online violence that is directed disproportionately against women and girls, as well as we noted here today, targeted at other marginal groups such as LGBTI individuals. And women in position of power and human rights defenders are targeted even more. And the Government of Canada believes in the promotion and protection of the human rights of women and girls to access digital technology without being targeted by online violence and abuse. That's why in 2018, we worked through Canada's G7 presidency to bring more attention to this issue, culminating in the Charlevoix commitment to end sexual and gender-based violence, abuse, and harassment in digital contexts, and why we focused the Canada-led Human Rights Council resolution on violence against women in 2018 on online violence. We also heard today about the risk of violence and the experience of violence of women and girls using public transportation. You know, in 2017, just for more statistics, there was a report by Unfpa on sexual harassment in public transportation in Sri Lanka that found that 90% of women had been sexually harassed on public transport. And we know that for girls, this is one of the risks that prevents them from continuing their education, and it's contributing to a situation where an estimated 130 million girls worldwide between the ages of 6 and 17 are out of school. This data is driving action here at IDRC, and it's driving action at Global Affairs Canada, and it's motivating us in our country programming and in our international commitments to do more to address gender-based violence. As an example, gender-based violence was identified as one of the barriers to education that Canada and other donors are just working to address through the historic commitment made to women and girls' education and skills development in fragile and conflict-affected states that was announced at the G7 Leaders Summit last June. As Dominique pointed out in her opening remarks, today's event is also a part of the mobilization towards Women Deliver 2019, which is 86 days away. As a global champion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, Canada is proud to be hosting Women Deliver 2019 conference in Vancouver this coming June. This conference will bring together more than 7,000 world leaders, influencers, advocates, academics, activists, and journalists from more than 160 countries, with an additional 100,000 people joining virtually. Women Deliver 2019 n'est pas juste une conférence.
This is not just a conference, it's a world movement that promotes gender equality throughout the world, in order to focus on health, the rights, and the well-being of women and girls. This is a movement which gives a voice to people who are disadvantaged, Aboriginal people, and people who are going through crises. Canada is very proud to be part of that movement.
Panel. We look forward to continuing to work together as feminists, researchers, practitioners, and advocates to achieve gender equality. Happy International Women's Day, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. I think as a Canadian, we're very proud that IDRC and Global Affairs are working together, and I think for the last time today, we'll just remind you again of the Women Deliver Conference, and that this is a series of discussions and panels that IDRC has been putting into place leading towards Women's Deliver in Vancouver in June. So the next panel in this series is going to be on breaking glass ceilings in science and research in the Global South, and that's going to take place here on April the 11th from 1 to 2:30 plus. So we welcome all of you, and you may not be able to be here, but that'll be the next part of the journey. So thank you all for taking the time to spend International Women's Day here with us at IDRC this afternoon. Stay tuned to the IDRC website and an email bulletin for details of further events. And I think on behalf of everybody in the room, I just want to thank our panelists for your research, for your courage, for your inspiration. I think we're all leaving today feeling more sober. We know how hard these issues are, but also encouraged by the fact that your research is ongoing and it's going to make a difference. So thank you all very much for being here.